Sunday dinner was supposed to be cozy and ordinary, the kind of ritual you count on when life feels uncertain. Instead, it became the night my whole childhood snapped into focus. I'm Lauren, 29, and I was sitting at the old oak dining table I grew up around, my fiancé Ethan beside me, when my dad slid a white envelope across the table, not to me, but to my older sister, Olivia, 32. "We've decided to give the wedding fund to Olivia," he announced, like it was a sensible business decision. "She deserves a real wedding." Mom nodded proudly while Olivia's face lit up, that satisfied, almost triumphant smile I knew too well. I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding as 6 months of planning around that promised $10,000 vanished in a single sentence. Dad leaned back in his chair, giving me that familiar, "let me explain life to you" look. He started in on Olivia's resume, top of her class at Duke, senior marketing executive at a huge tech firm, engaged to Daniel, a CPA from a solid family. Then he turned to me like I was a disappointing quarterly report. Community college, freelance graphic designer. Tiny downtown apartment. The daughter who'd needed help with rent more than once. Mom chimed in about how they couldn't throw good money after bad, and how Olivia's wedding was an investment in her future. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table, but the message was already clear. My love, my dreams, my happiness were a risky bet, and my sister was the only one worth backing. The lecture didn't stop there. My father folded his hands like a judge, ready to deliver a verdict, his voice dropping into that calm, disappointed tone I had heard my whole life. He said they were just being realistic, that Olivia had proven she could handle responsibility, while I was still trying to find my footing. Mom added that Olivia's fiancé came from the right kind of family, the sort you could trust with long-term plans and shared finances. Olivia sat a little taller in her chair, smoothing her blazer, soaking in every word like sunlight. Her engagement ring sparkled under the dining room light, a silent reminder that she had reached a finish line I, apparently, was still jogging toward. I stared at my plate, feeling 16 again, remembering how Dad showed up late to my high school art show because Olivia had a networking event downtown. I thought about how she got a brand new Honda at 16, while I inherited Dad's old truck with a cracked dashboard. The pattern was so familiar, it almost felt comforting, like emotional muscle memory. Then my mother turned her attention to Ethan. She smiled politely, the way you smile at someone you don't expect to see again. "You seem like a nice young man," she said, careful and cautious. "But you're always so vague about what you do. We don't really understand your job." I felt my stomach tighten. Ethan had always said he worked in technology, and I'd never pushed for details. In that moment, seated across from my parents' raised eyebrows and Olivia's curious stare, I wondered if their doubts were rubbing off on me. Dad nodded slowly and said they worried about my future, about tying myself to instability, about whether this marriage would only make my life harder. When he said they didn't want to enable bad decisions, it felt like he wasn't just talking about money, but about me as a person. Olivia finally spoke, her voice gentle but sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk. She said she had always been careful with money, that she'd never had to ask our parents for help, that she had savings, investments, and a plan. The implication hung heavy in the air. I was the reckless one, the dreamer. The daughter who chose passion over security and love over optics. Mom reached for Olivia's hand and said her wedding was about building a strong foundation, something substantial. I tried to ask what that made mine, but my voice came out thin. Dad sighed and told me my foundation was shaky, and I realized then that in their eyes, I had been standing on unstable ground my entire life, no matter how hard I tried to prove otherwise. The air around the table grew heavier by the second, thick with judgment and everything I'd swallowed for years. Olivia went on about deposits she had already paid, the country club ballroom, the caterer, the photographer, all spoken with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. My mother chimed in again, saying they wanted her day to be perfect, that she had worked so hard for everything she had. I wanted to scream that I had worked hard too, just in different ways that never seemed to count in this house. Ethan stayed quiet beside me, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, his calm presence the only thing keeping me from falling apart. I could almost feel my parents sizing him up, weighing his worth based on his clothes, his silence, the lack of flashy signals they were used to respecting. I finally asked if this was really it, if 29 years of being their daughter could be reduced to a balance sheet and a list of credentials. My mother waved off my words and told me not to be dramatic, that this wasn't about love, it was about being sensible. Sensible. The word stung because nothing about me had ever been considered sensible enough by their standards. Not my art degree, not my freelance career, not my downtown apartment that I loved, not the man I chose to spend my life with. The envelope sat in front of Olivia like a trophy, and her fingers tapped against it, impatient and victorious. That was when Ethan slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. The sound of it scraping against the hardwood floor cut through the room, sharp and unavoidable. Everyone stopped talking. He didn't raise his voice or look angry, just calm in a way that made my heart race. He pulled his phone from his pocket, then looked at me, not my parents. "Do you want me to explain what I actually do for a living?" he asked gently. The question caught me off guard. I realized, with a small jolt of shame and surprise, that I didn't fully know the answer. I had trusted him, but I had never questioned him. Ethan turned the phone so we could all see the screen. A sleek website appeared, all clean lines and professional polish, with his photo at the top. He looked different there, confident, composed, wearing a tailored suit instead of the soft sweater beside me. "I'm the founder and CEO of Sentinel Core Technologies," he said calmly. The words hit the room like a dropped plate. My sister's face drained of color. My father froze mid-breath. My mother's fork slipped from her hand and clattered loudly against the table. Ethan continued without rushing, explaining that he had started the company in his garage years ago, that they specialized in cybersecurity for large corporations, that they employed hundreds of people across several states. As he spoke, my entire understanding of the evening shifted. The man they had dismissed as vague and unimpressive was standing there owning the room, and for the first time in my life, the story they thought they were telling about me was about to unravel. No one spoke for a moment, as if the walls themselves needed time to absorb what Ethan had just said. Then my father let out a small, disbelieving laugh, the kind people make when reality doesn't match their expectations. Ethan didn't react. He calmly scrolled through his phone, showing articles, awards, and photos of himself shaking hands with executives in glass-walled boardrooms. He explained that Sentinel Core protected sensitive data for hospitals, banks, and major retailers, that cyber attacks were a constant threat, and that his company's software adapted in real time to stop them. His voice was steady, factual, almost humble, which somehow made it more powerful. My mother pressed her hand to her chest as she recognized the company name, finally connecting it to the commercial she watched during the evening news. My sister's confident posture collapsed, her shoulders slumping as the room's attention shifted away from her entirely. Ethan went on, saying they had recently gone public, that the company was valued in the tens of millions and that growth had been rapid but demanding. I stared at him, stunned, feeling like I was meeting a new version of the man I loved and realizing how carefully he had guarded this truth. When I asked, barely above a whisper, why he never told me, his expression softened. He said he wanted to be sure I loved him for who he was, not for what he had built. He had seen money change relationships, twist expectations, and he didn't want that poison near us. The sincerity of it tightened my throat. My father began stumbling over apologies, saying they had no idea, that there must have been a misunderstanding. My mother nodded too quickly, claiming they never meant to disrespect our relationship. Ethan listened, then gently but firmly explained that respect isn't something you give only after you see a bank account. It's how you treat people when you believe they have nothing to offer you. The truth landed hard. My parents' faces reflected the realization that they had judged both of us harshly and publicly, based on assumptions they never bothered to question. When they tried to backpedal, offering to rethink the wedding money or split it between us, my sister snapped, clutching the envelope protectively and arguing that it was already hers. The tension felt like it might break something permanent. I finally stood up, my hands shaking but my voice surprisingly clear, and told them the worst part wasn't the money. It was 29 years of being treated like the second option, the backup plan, the daughter whose choices were always framed as cautionary tales next to my sister's success story. As the words poured out, I felt something inside me loosen, like a knot I'd carried my entire life finally starting to unravel. The room stayed eerily quiet after my words, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. My parents looked at me like they were seeing me clearly for the first time, not as Olivia's less successful sister, but as a daughter with years of hurt behind her eyes. Ethan stepped closer then, resting a steady hand on my shoulder. I could feel his calm grounding me, reminding me I wasn't alone anymore. My sister broke the silence with a sharp laugh, brittle and defensive, insisting none of this had been personal, that our parents were just trying to be fair. But her voice trembled, and the envelope in front of her suddenly looked less like a prize and more like evidence. That was when Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim tablet. He didn't look at my parents or my sister. He turned it toward me, his eyes warm, almost shy. "I was saving this for later," he said, "but maybe now is the right time." The screen lit up with a photograph so beautiful it stole my breath. Rolling vineyards, golden light, and a stone estate perched among the hills like something out of a movie. He explained softly that it was a private vineyard in California's wine country, that he had reserved it for an intimate wedding. As he swiped through images of courtyards, guest houses, and sunset views, my chest tightened with emotion. This was the wedding I never dared to dream of, quietly planned by a man my family had just dismissed as unstable and vague. My mother's lips parted in shock. My father sank back into his chair, suddenly small and shaken. Olivia stared at the screen, her expression cracking as the reality settled in. Ethan told me about the planner he'd been working with, the small guest list, the focus on warmth and togetherness instead of spectacle. He said he wanted a day that celebrated love, not status. Tears blurred my vision as I realized how deeply he saw me, how carefully he had listened to every offhand comment I'd ever made about what mattered to me. When he finally looked up and asked if it was what I wanted, I nodded, unable to speak. In that moment, the envelope on my parents' table lost all meaning. The $10,000 they'd argued over felt insignificant compared to the respect and devotion Ethan had shown me. I understood then that my worth had never depended on their approval or their money. Standing there, with years of resentment giving way to clarity, I knew this was the moment everything changed. Not because my fiancé was successful, but because I finally chose to believe that I deserved to be fully valued, exactly as I am. The fallout came faster than I expected, like a row of dominoes finally tipping over. 2 weeks after that disastrous dinner, my phone rang just after sunrise. It was Olivia. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her words at first. Her voice cracked and frantic in a way I had never heard before. She told me the country club had called, claiming unexpected renovation costs and doubled the venue price overnight. What had been an $8,000 ballroom was suddenly $18,000. And the contract's fine print gave the club just enough leverage to demand it. Even with our parents' money, she couldn't cover the difference. I sat on the edge of my bed, stunned, while Ethan quietly made coffee behind me, already sensing the weight of the conversation. As Olivia kept talking, the situation unraveled even more. Her maid of honor dropped out, saying she couldn't support someone who took her sister's wedding money. A few bridesmaids followed. The photographer canceled. The dress boutique demanded full payment up front after concerns about her credit. Then came the part that made my stomach sink. Her boss had called her into a meeting. Rumors about family drama and poor judgment were circulating at work, and HR wanted to be sure it wouldn't affect her performance. The world Olivia had worked so hard to polish was starting to crack, and every crack felt public. I felt torn listening to her. For most of my life, she'd been the one standing tall while I shrank. Now she was calling me for help, her pride stripped away. I suggested scaling back, something smaller, more intimate, but she sobbed that she couldn't handle the embarrassment. She had already told everyone about the venue, the plans, the image. Appearances still mattered more to her than peace. Finally, she asked the question I'd been expecting, her voice barely a whisper. She wondered if Ethan might consider helping. When the call ended, the apartment felt unusually quiet. Ethan sat beside me and asked what I wanted to do, not what my family deserved. The choice rested with me, and that realization felt heavy but empowering. I explained that helping wasn't about money anymore. It was about boundaries, accountability, and respect. The next months showed the full contrast between our paths. Ethan and I married in the fall at the vineyard he had shown me, surrounded by people who truly celebrated our love. Olivia's wedding, held later in a modest community hall, was far simpler than she'd imagined. Watching it all unfold, I realized something painful but freeing. The crisis didn't destroy my family. It exposed it. For the first time, everyone was forced to see the cost of favoritism, assumptions, and conditional love. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one carrying that weight alone. 3 months after Olivia's wedding, my father called and asked if we could have lunch together, just the two of us. His voice sounded different, quieter, almost unsure. We met at a small cafe near my studio, nothing fancy, and for once, he didn't start the conversation with advice or criticism. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and told me he had begun seeing a therapist. The admission startled me more than any apology could have. He confessed that after the wedding disaster, my mother pushed him to confront patterns he had ignored for decades. In his sessions, he realized he had been living through Olivia's achievements, using her success to measure his own self-worth, while quietly dismissing mine because it didn't fit his definition of accomplishment. As he spoke, memories surfaced between us like ghosts. He acknowledged missing my graduation because of Olivia's work dinner, brushing off my freelance milestones, and framing every offer of help as a lecture. When he apologized, it wasn't rushed or defensive. He named specific moments, specific hurts, and that was what finally broke me. I told him how small I'd felt at that dining table, how often I'd questioned my value as a daughter. Tears slipped down his face, unguarded and raw, and for the first time I saw him not as an authority figure, but as a flawed man who had failed one of the people he loved most. Before we left, he looked at me and said the words I had secretly waited my entire life to hear. He told me he was proud of my creativity, my independence, and the courage it took to build a life on my own terms. The validation landed deeper than I expected. It didn't erase the past, but it softened it. In the weeks that followed, my mother began making real, consistent efforts to change. She asked about my work, listened without comparing, and included Ethan as family, not an afterthought. Olivia and I met for lunch 6 months later. She looked different, less polished, more honest. She admitted the competition between us had consumed her, that she had chased approval instead of connection. When she apologized, it felt sincere. We cried together, releasing years of resentment. And in that moment, I understood that healing didn't mean forgetting what happened. It meant choosing to build something healthier from the truth, even when that truth was painful. 2 years later, our family gathered again around a dinner table, and the difference was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just that the tension was gone, but that the room felt open in a way it never had before. Conversations flowed without interruption or competition. No one was keeping score. My father sat comfortably in his chair, no longer dominating the discussion, but listening with genuine interest. When Ethan talked about expanding his company into new markets, Dad asked thoughtful questions instead of turning the moment into a lecture. My mother shared stories about her volunteer work at a local literacy program, and for once, everyone leaned in and listened. Olivia laughed more than I remembered her ever laughing, lighter and less guarded. She spoke openly about her recent promotion and the satisfaction she felt now that her worth wasn't tied to impressing anyone. She and her husband talked about budgeting, patience, and learning to build something real together. There was humility in her voice, but also peace. I watched her carefully, realizing that the sister I once felt overshadowed by had finally stepped out of the role she'd been trapped in for years. We weren't rivals anymore. We were just 2 women with different paths, learning to respect each other's choices. At one point, my father raised his glass for a toast. The room went quiet, not with fear, but with trust. He spoke about family, about mistakes made and lessons learned, about how pride and assumptions nearly cost him the relationship with his daughters. When he looked at me and said he was proud of the woman I had become, there was no hesitation in his voice, no comparison, just acceptance. I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with wine or polite applause. Ethan slid his hand into mine under the table, a familiar gesture that reminded me how far we'd come. I realized then that the crisis over the wedding fund had never really been about money. It had been a mirror, forcing all of us to confront uncomfortable truths about favoritism, expectations, and conditional love. That painful Sunday dinner shattered old patterns that had quietly controlled our family for decades. In their place, something sturdier had begun to grow. As dessert was served and laughter filled the room, I understood a lesson it had taken me years to learn. My worth had never depended on approval, titles, or achievements. It existed simply because I did. And while not every family gets the chance to heal, we had chosen to face our mistakes instead of burying them. Sometimes conflict isn't the end of a relationship, but the beginning of a more honest one. That night, surrounded by genuine conversation and unguarded smiles, I finally felt like I belonged, not as Olivia's shadow, but as myself. As time passed, I found myself reflecting more deeply on what those events had taught me, not just about my family, but about myself. For years, I had quietly agreed with the version of me they projected, the daughter who was almost successful, nearly stable, but never quite enough. I realized how many choices I'd made trying to prove my worth instead of trusting it. Healing wasn't a dramatic moment or a single apology. It was a series of small, intentional shifts. I stopped over-explaining my decisions. I stopped shrinking my accomplishments to make others comfortable. When conversations drifted toward comparisons, I gently redirected them or stepped away altogether. Boundaries, I learned, weren't punishments. They were acts of self-respect. My relationship with Ethan deepened in quieter ways, too. Watching how he navigated conflict without arrogance or resentment showed me what real confidence looks like. He never needed to weaponize his success or demand recognition. He simply stood firm, consistent, and kind. Together, we built routines that reflected our values. Slow mornings, shared meals, laughter over small things. Success in our home wasn't measured in headlines or numbers, but in safety and understanding. That steadiness helped me trust myself more, especially when old doubts tried to resurface. My parents continued their work, sometimes stumbling, sometimes getting it right. There were awkward moments and uncomfortable pauses, but there was also sincerity. My mother began asking questions and waiting for answers. My father learned to validate without advising. I noticed how effort, even imperfect effort, can reshape long-standing wounds when it's honest. Olivia and I kept meeting for lunch, no longer to compare lives, but to share them. We talked about marriage, finances, fears, and the pressure women often carry to win at life. Without competition between us, there was room for empathy. Looking back, I see now that the wedding fund wasn't stolen from me. It was a catalyst. It forced light into places we'd all avoided. It showed me that respect doesn't come from convincing others of your value, but from believing it yourself. I learned that love without conditions is rare, but worth protecting when you find it. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that breaking a cycle doesn't require anger. Sometimes it simply takes clarity and the courage to stop accepting less than you deserve. That clarity became the foundation for everything I built afterward, and it changed the way I showed up, not just for my family, but for myself.